Today, I want to talk about one of the most common failure points in vendor risk reviews. A vendor answers yes. The box is checked, and the review quietly ends. That yes feels responsible, but in practice, it often replaces judgment with reassurance. This framework explains when vendor risk questions should actually trigger escalation, and why yes is often the wrong stopping point. This is the default workflow I see everywhere. A questionnaire comes in, answers look fine, nothing obviously alarming, and the assessment quietly gets accepted. It feels responsible, but it's often where risk starts to accumulate. The issue isn't that these questions are meaningless. The issue is treating answers as closure instead of inputs. A yes doesn't reduce risk by itself. It just gives you information. What matters is what happens next. This is the default flow I see most often. A questionnaire comes in, vendor answers yes, nothing looks alarming, so there's no follow-up. The risk isn't reduced, it's just quietly accepted. This feels responsible, but it's usually where unmanaged risk begins. This is the key shift. The question isn't whether the vendor said yes. The question is whether that answer actually changes our risk posture. If the answer doesn't affect access, data sensitivity, scope, or enforcement, then it's not a decision, it's reassurance. Risk management starts when answers drive action, and not when they end the conversation. This is how questionnaires quietly fail. A question is asked, a yes is recorded, and because nothing looks obviously wrong, there's no follow-up. Over time, that temporary approval becomes permanent, and the risk becomes normal. Escalation doesn't mean panic. It means choosing the right response based on risk. Sometimes that's asking for evidence. Sometimes it's limiting access. Sometimes it's explicitly accepting the risk or replacing the vendor. The key point is that doing nothing is also a decision, just an undocumented one. This example shows how vendor responses translate into enforcement decisions for a critical control. A no response indicates that encryption at rest is not implemented and requires immediate escalation. An out-of-scope response does not close the review. It signals uncertainty about data location or protection and is treated as a risk condition requiring escalation. A yes response confirms the expected control, but still requires validation to ensure encryption applies to the relevant data and environment. The objective is not reassurance. It's to determine whether to validate controls, escalate risk, or enforce contractual requirements. This slide illustrates why vendor responses cannot be evaluated in isolation. A yes answer may be acceptable for low-risk vendors with limited data exposure. For moderate-risk vendors, the same answers typically require validation to confirm that controls are implemented as described. For high-risk vendors, a yes response does not provide assurance on its own. When data sensitivity is high or responsibility is shared or unclear, the appropriate outcomes is escalation, including evidence review, contractual clarification, or risk-owned approval. Risk decisions should be driven by impact and confidence, and not by presence of a checkbox. Escalation decisions are based on context and not individual answers. For vendors with low impact data, even limited assurance may be acceptable and can be monitored. For vendors with moderate impact, stronger assurance supports managed risk and continued oversight. When a vendor handles sensitive or regulated data, but provides weak or self-attested assurance, escalation is required, regardless of how many controls are marked yes. At that point, the decision shifts from reviewing answers to determining ownership, evidence, or contractual action. Vendor answers by themselves don't manage risk. What creates value is what happens after the answer, adding context, understanding impact, and making a clear decision. That's where MSPs step in, translating vendor responses into actions clients can rely on. Clients don't want more questionnaires. They want confidence that someone is actually deciding what's acceptable and what's not. This framework isn't about adding more questions or more process. It focuses on using the answers you already collect to make clear, defensible decisions, especially when risk meaningfully changes. That's how vendor risk becomes manageable without enterprise tooling, heavy process, or constant escalation. And thanks for your time. My name is Diana from Defocus Trends. I build vendor risk tools for small businesses that work in the real world. Subscribe for more practical compliance content.